The first sign that our lives were being quietly erased came with the taste of metal on my tongue. Sharp and wrong, lingering long after I swallowed the water I'd trusted since childhood. I didn't know then that someone had decided to kill us slowly, patiently, with smiles and paperwork. But that moment became the line between the life I had and the war I was about to fight. Our well had always been pure, cold, and reliable, the heart of our land. Yet suddenly my mother's hands shook, my father's strength faded, and my little sister collapsed at the dinner table, her lips pale, her eyes confused. Doctors called it coincidence, neighbors called it stress. Only one person watched from her porch with crossed arms and a satisfied smirk, as if she were counting days. Her name was Karen, and she ruled our street like a petty queen, obsessed with control, fines, and punishment disguised as rules. Weeks passed, and sickness tightened its grip. Hospital visits became routine, bills stacked like gravestones. Every test came back inconclusive, every specialist shrugged, and fear grew heavier than anger. I started to notice patterns others missed. The timing of our symptoms, the way rainwater runoff flowed, the way Karen's complaints to the county always mentioned our unsafe property. One night, as I filled a glass from the tap and watched the light bend strangely through the water, I felt certainty settle in my chest. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone was poisoning us, drop by drop, believing patience made them invisible. I began documenting everything. Dates, symptoms, Karen's visits, her threats whispered with fake concern. She told anyone who'd listened that our well was illegal, that our family was a danger. She played the victim perfectly, while my family withered behind closed doors. Rage burned in me, but I buried it under discipline. If she wanted to destroy us quietly, I would answer with truth so loud it would echo in courtrooms. I didn't want revenge through violence. I wanted something colder, something permanent, evidence. Late one night, as my sister slept hooked to monitors, I stood by the well with a notebook and a promise. Whoever did this would lose everything they used to hurt us, their freedom, their reputation, their power. I didn't know how long it would take, or how deep the rot went, but I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. Karen thought she was poisoning our water. In reality, she was poisoning her own future, and I was about to make sure the world watched it happen. The next morning I stopped drinking the water entirely, but I didn't tell Karen that. Instead, I played the role she expected. The confused neighbor, the overwhelmed son, the family slowly falling apart. Inside, I was mapping a battlefield. I bought sealed water jugs, installed hidden filters, and sent samples from the well to 3 different independent labs, each under a different name. If someone was poisoning us, I needed proof that couldn't be brushed aside or buried by bureaucracy. While the tests were running, I studied Karen. Every villain makes mistakes when they believe they're untouchable. She suddenly stopped using her own well and had bottled water delivered weekly. She started wearing gloves when gardening near the property line. She began filing complaints about our land almost daily, trying to force inspectors onto our property. Each move screamed guilt, but suspicion alone meant nothing. I needed a chain of facts so tight it could choke her lies. I installed discreet cameras near the well house and along the shared boundary, careful to stay within legal limits. Night after night I reviewed footage, learning her patterns. She always walked her dog late, always paused near the fence, always lingered just long enough to pretend she was tying a shoe or checking her phone. Weeks passed, and then one night, the footage finally showed something different. A small container in her hand. A pause. A tilt. Liquid disappearing into the ground near the well's intake line. My hands shook as I replayed it again and again. My stomach turning not from fear, but from clarity. The lab results arrived within days. Heavy metals, industrial-grade toxins not found naturally in our soil. Slow-acting, cumulative, chosen specifically to make symptoms look like illness instead of attack. One lab flagged it as intentional contamination. Another suggested the poison was commonly used in pest control and industrial cleaning. I remembered Karen bragging about her connections and her husband's old maintenance job. The pieces locked together with a sickening click. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. I knew better than to confront her. People like Karen thrive on chaos and denial. Instead, I expanded the net. I requested public records of her purchases, zoning complaints, and correspondence with county officials. I spoke quietly with neighbors, not accusing, just listening. Patterns emerged. Others had pets get sick. Plants die. All downhill from her property. She had been practicing for years. By the time my father was discharged from the hospital, weak but alive, I had a folder thick enough to ruin someone's life. But evidence alone isn't justice unless it's delivered the right way. Karen thought she was careful. She had no idea she was already standing on a trap I was still sharpening, waiting for the moment it would snap shut around her world. I shifted from gathering proof to shaping the moment it would be impossible to ignore. Evidence is fragile until it's contextualized, so I built a timeline that told a story even a skeptic could follow. I annotated the footage with dates, cross-referenced lab reports, and matched toxin spikes to Karen's late-night walks. I logged hospital admissions beside county complaints she filed within hours of our symptoms worsening. Every coincidence dissolved into intent. To protect my family, I installed a temporary bypass that fed our house from sealed tanks, while preserving the well exactly as it was. I wanted the contamination untouched, a snapshot of her crime. I also contacted an environmental attorney anonymously, asking what standard of proof agencies required to pursue criminal charges. The answer was clear. Corroboration, chain of custody, and motive. I had two. I needed the third. Motive arrived through public records. Karen had been fined years earlier for an unpermitted drainage alteration. Our well sat downstream from the violation. If inspectors tested the area, she'd be liable. Poisoning our water reframed the narrative, making us the hazard. I filed a Freedom of Information request for her emails with county staff. Buried in bureaucratic language was a line that chilled me. If they're forced to abandon the well, the issue resolves itself. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to smell. I staged nothing. I simply waited and watched. On a rainy evening, she returned with the same container, confident weather-erased footprints. The camera caught her face clearly this time. I duplicated the footage, sealed the original drives, and logged the transfer. Then I called the environmental agency. Not as an accuser, but as a whistleblower, reporting suspected groundwater contamination with supporting data. Within 48 hours, inspectors arrived unannounced. Karen's porch smile cracked. They took samples, they flagged the metals, they widened the perimeter. When they traced the gradient, it pointed straight back to her property. She argued. She blamed runoff. She tried to charm. None of it mattered. Process had replaced personality. I handed over my binder, the labs, the footage, the emails. The room went quiet in the way storms do right before the sky breaks. As investigators escorted her inside for questioning, Karen looked at me like I'd betrayed some unspoken neighbor code. I felt no triumph, only relief. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability, finally heavier than her lies. And as the door closed, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because truth doesn't end a story. It demands the consequences that follow. Outside, rain washed the street clean. But nothing could rinse away the record we'd built together, brick by brick, fact by fact, without mercy or delay. The day the inspectors left, I realized Karen's world was already unraveling, even if she refused to see it. Her calls to neighbors went unanswered. Her social media, once polished with her perfect street posts, went silent. The first cracks appeared in her confidence. Small, almost imperceptible, like a tree bending before a storm. But I knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Justice isn't in the moments before verdicts. It's in the weight of consequences, and hers were only beginning. I turned my attention to compiling the public record case. Every toxicology report, every lab analysis, every surveillance frame, meticulously organized. I labeled files for clarity, cross-referencing symptoms with dates and quantities, linking hospital admissions to spikes in contamination levels. I knew that a jury wouldn't be swayed by fear. They would be swayed by order, by irrefutable evidence, by the story that couldn't be dismissed. And I intended to give them that story. Meanwhile, Karen tried to reclaim control in small ways. She confronted neighbors, whispered rumors, threatened lawsuits. She assumed intimidation could erase the trail of her crimes. But each act she made was another thread in the web of evidence. Neighbors started coming forward quietly, reporting sudden pet deaths, plant decay, unexplained illnesses. Their statements would later strengthen the chain, proving this was not isolated or accidental. It was deliberate. Late at night, I reflected on the subtle cruelty she had wielded over my family. Poisoning isn't sudden. It's patient, insidious, leaving victims unsure whether they're sick, unlucky, or imagined. My father's weakened hands, my sister's pale lips, my mother's exhaustion. All of it had been deliberate, orchestrated under the guise of neighborly concern. That understanding fueled my focus. I wanted her to feel powerless in the same precise way she had made us feel. Not violence, but truth. I also ensured that my family's recovery was documented. Photos of water tests, medical records, and detailed symptom logs were all collected. We were no longer just victims. We were living proof of her crime. Each record was a step toward flipping her narrative from perfect neighborhood citizen to the architect of slow, deliberate suffering. By now, Karen's demeanor had shifted from arrogance to desperation. She was polite with inspectors, but tense with every glance toward my property. It was almost cinematic. The poised queen stripped of her kingdom, forced to watch as the world recalibrated around her misdeeds. But I stayed patient, knowing that the final act would require the right stage, the right audience, and the weight of evidence so heavy that no charm or excuse could tip the scales. As night fell, I reviewed the footage once more. Every frame, every drop, every hesitation was recorded and backed up. I whispered to myself what I had promised weeks ago. Her freedom would be the price of her cruelty, and I knew that day was approaching. The first court date felt surreal. Karen sat across from me, her eyes darting nervously as her lawyer shuffled papers, desperately trying to obscure the trail she had left behind. But there was no hiding from the truth now. The binder I carried was a fortress of evidence. Water analyses, hospital records, timestamps from our surveillance, email correspondence, and sworn neighbor statements. Each page was a nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed facade. The prosecution began with the timeline. Dates, symptoms, and toxins aligned like dominoes, proving not just negligence, but intent. Expert witnesses explained the slow-acting poisons, how they would mimic illness, and why only deliberate exposure could produce the patterns we documented. They displayed the lab reports, showing contamination spikes corresponding precisely with Karen's visits near our property. The courtroom absorbed every fact, every graph, every visual aid, and it was impossible to argue against what had been meticulously preserved. Karen tried to speak, to claim misunderstanding, to shift blame to runoff or coincidence. Her voice faltered. Her confident posture, once impenetrable, shrank with each word she uttered. The jury watched a woman unraveling, her arrogance stripped by documented proof. Witnesses recounted illnesses, hospital visits, and personal accounts of her threats, all painting the same picture. A calculated campaign to harm, to intimidate, to control. I stayed calm, focusing on my family. My parents sat beside me, my sister holding tightly to her recovery milestones. Our collective presence a silent reminder of what Karen had tried to destroy. Each statement reinforced the human cost of her actions. This was not a story about property lines or petty disputes. It was about life, survival, and justice, finally catching up with cruelty. When my testimony came, I recounted our ordeal in detail. I spoke of the fear, the slow erosion of our health, and the moments we realized someone was deliberately poisoning us. I described how evidence was gathered, how patience and method replaced impulsive anger, and how every action was taken with precision to ensure justice could be served. The courtroom remained hushed, hanging on each word, understanding the enormity of the betrayal we had endured. By the end of the day, it was clear the tide had turned. Karen's attempts to manipulate perception failed against the sheer weight of truth. The judge adjourned, and though the final verdict was still pending, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was a tangible force moving steadily toward her, and when it struck, it would be absolute, leaving her powerless in the very way she had made us suffer. The verdict day arrived like a storm we had all been bracing for. Karen entered the courtroom with the same forced composure she had tried to maintain for weeks, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Her lawyer whispered rapidly, trying to salvage whatever defense remained, but the evidence was a fortress no argument could breach. Every chart, every lab report, every neighbor statement we had painstakingly collected now stood as an unshakable testament to her actions. When the jury filed in, the room felt electric. Faces locked on her, then on me, then back to the meticulously laid out evidence. They had seen the slow destruction of our family, the insidious poisoning, the manipulation and control hidden behind a mask of civility. And now they held the power to ensure accountability. The foreperson cleared her throat and the room seemed to collectively inhale. The first word, guilty, hit like thunder. Karen's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her carefully rehearsed defenses, her attempts to charm and intimidate, were now irrelevant. The verdict wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. Every detail we had documented, every patient observation, every act of courage in the face of fear, had combined to topple the illusion she had built over years. The courtroom buzzed with relief and tension as the sentence was read. Years of imprisonment, fines, and permanent restrictions. Her freedom stripped clean. As she was led away, I didn't feel triumph or glee. I felt something quieter but deeper. Closure. My family had endured fear, illness, and uncertainty, yet we had survived. We had turned the tools of justice into a weapon of accountability, ensuring that cruelty could not go unchecked. My parents hugged me tightly. My sister whispered thanks through tears, and for the first time in months, the weight pressing on our shoulders began to lift. Outside the courthouse, the world felt sharper, cleaner, and somehow safer. The poison that had seeped into our lives was replaced by clarity, and our community, once silent, now understood the consequences of underestimating cruelty. Karen's reign of terror had ended, but more importantly, the principle had been restored. Deliberate harm brings consequences, and no mask of civility can hide a predator forever. In the weeks after, life returned to a fragile normal. Our well was tested daily, cleaned and secured. Friends and neighbors visited, offering support and gratitude for revealing the truth. Each day, we reclaimed pieces of life that had been threatened, and with every drop of clean water, we were reminded of the patience, courage, and precision it had taken to protect our family. Justice was no longer an abstract concept. It was the tangible force that finally restored balance to our world. The poison had been defeated, and freedom, true, undeniable freedom, had been reclaimed.